One of the things that the original Planet of the Apes movies do really well is include little details from previous movies. Dr. Hessline, the villain of Escape, is actually first mentioned in the beginning of the first movie as a scientist with a theory of time dilation. Mendez from Battle is clearly meant to be the ancestor of Mendez from Beneath. Even Aldo from Battle is first mentioned in Escape as a character in Zira and Cornelius' history. It's just, it would have been nice to have the same attention to detail for those that actually matter.
18 months.
8 years, 20 years.
Less than 2 centuries.
3 more centuries.
2,000 years.
We'll start with something relatively simple, basic dates for when things happened. These movies mentioned, at a minimum, specific years a lot, so this should be pretty easy. Planet of the Apes starts 6 months after Taylor and his crew left Cape Kennedy on Earth. We see the current ship time, July 14th, 1972, which means that the crew left Earth on January 14th, 1972. Unfortunately, by the time we get to Escape, apparently the writers forgot this, because now both Taylor and his crew and Brent and his crew disappeared
Over 2 years.
before Escape, which is confirmed in both Escape, by way of Zira saying that's what the ship they arrived in said, and Battle to take place in 1973, which means the crews disappeared at the latest in 1971, because of course they did, because that's when Escape came out. Okay, so a 1-year mistake, that's not the worst. Maybe the TV announcer that said over 2 years ago made a slip of the tongue and meant to say almost. What about 23 years? See, in the original movie, we also see the date the crew landed on Earth by way of the Earth time clock, November 25th, 3978. That date doesn't even last one movie, as at the beginning of Beneath, Brent says his ship's clock said
3955.
23 years before the first movie takes place. So either Brent's been sitting around his ship for 23 years, or something's gone horribly wrong. And indeed, it seems actually the writers just forgot about the first movie again, because Escape confirms that Taylor's ship that
3955.
right before Zira, Cornelius, and Milo got sent to the past. Though that date becomes 1950 by the time Battle rolls around, as they carefully edit around a clip from Escape of Zira saying it was 3950 something to remove the something part. Not that that clip should even exist in the way it does in Battle, as it's shown as a video clip, despite the fact that while Hessline did record it, it was very clearly only recorded in audio form. And Escape really becomes the center of these timeline and frankly other continuity errors. The scene where Cornelius and Zira explain to Hessline the history of apes causes so many problems, some retroactively, but starting with the fact that they shouldn't know this history. Indeed, one of the main aspects of the first movie is that apes don't know their history, and certainly don't know that humans used to be intelligent, which made it quite weird that Zira and Cornelius know about the ape revolution. You could claim it's because that while most apes don't know their history, the religious ones like Zeus do, because, as is said in Escape, this history is
Fully documented in the sacred scrolls.
and after the first movie, Zeus allowed them to learn it. But that doesn't explain how there could be
An historic day which is commemorated by my species.
for when the ape revolution against humans started. Speaking of the ape revolution, man, does it not take place as Cornelius and Zira said it did. We know that Conquest, the movie with the ape revolution, takes place in 1991 because there's a giant title card that tells us that. Which means, despite the fact that Armando says it's been
To 20 years.
that Caesar, previously Milo or Salome, a name changed with no explanation, is around 18 years old. We also see a statue commemorating the lost cats and dogs around the year 1983, presumably the year they all died, which means that at a maximum, in 8 years, apes become pets, became slaves, and then revolted. Meanwhile, in Escape, that timeline takes a bit longer. About 5 centuries longer. Indeed, Escape says it took
Less than 2 centuries.
for the apes to become slaves after they become pets, and
3 more centuries.
for them to start to speak. And the day commemorated by the apes is when Aldo says no back to his owner, which, First off, Aldo is not even in Conquest, and secondly, while the word
No!
is said a lot in Conquest, allowing for it to become a bit of a trigger word for the apes in battle, there's never a moment in Conquest when an ape, let alone Caesar, says no back to a human. Now, these issues wouldn't be so bad. After all, things can be forgotten, if not for the fact that every movie in this series uses clips from a previous movie, which means that they had these movies at their disposal. Battle is the worst for it because it carefully cuts around the description of the ape revolution to not bring up Aldo being the one to start the revolution or the fact that it was supposed to happen 5 centuries later than it did. What's especially infuriating about this is that Battle is partially about trying to change the future, so a clip showing that the future has already been changed would fit really well into that. So what do we do with all this nonsense? Well, I'm going to try to explain it away, but I'm going to be honest, it's not going to be the best explanation. Also, for the sake of this thought experiment, I'm not counting anything besides the movies, so no comics or books or anything like that. I know they exist, and I'll get to them eventually, but not for this. But first, let's talk about time travel. This series is very time travel based, so just as any other time travel story, there's absolutely no continuity with it. The first movie attempts to have some kind of scientific backing to its time travel, where going at close to the speed of light slows down time for the people going that speed. That allows for Taylor and the crew to go 2,000 years in 18 months. Indeed, the Earth time clock the ship has is just a clock estimating the date it is on Earth based on a theory Dr. Hessline has. This concept is quickly thrown out by the second movie, where suddenly it's just that they
Came through a defect, a slippage in time.
whatever that means, and suddenly the Earth time clock just has the magical power to tell you what date it is on Earth for some reason, and the reason for it existing at all is lost. Of course, they had to do this, because Brent following Taylor because they know something went wrong with Taylor's ship doesn't make any sense if at least 700 years, the length of time that had passed on Earth at the beginning of the first movie, had passed before something went wrong, and Taylor and Brent know each other. However, it does mean that after this point, the time travel just kinda does whatever it wants, like Zero, Cornelius, and Milo going back in time because of a
Backward disturbance in time.
due to the Earth blowing up and escape, or, as I like to call it, blunt force time travel. But this nonsense time travel is what we're going to try to use to fix this mess of a continuity. See, in Escape for the Planet of the Apes, Dr. Hessline attempts to describe time travel, an explanation that is repeated in Battle. The idea is that time is like a highway with infinite lanes, each lane going to a different future, but all going from the past to the future. The 3 apes traveled from their present, or their lane, into the present of Escape. Now, despite the fact that everyone says the apes are from their future, that concept of time travel seems to imply something very different, that instead the 3 apes are from a completely different timeline. Now, because in the first movie it's claimed ape society existed for 2,000 years, that means that the Escape apes can't be from the same timeline as that movie, because they claim ape society started only 1,500 years before the world exploded. Now, it's possible that Cornelius and Zira, while telling Dr. Hessline the story of the ape revolution, were just making things up, but they're too close to what actually ends up happening in Conquest for that to make much sense. Instead, I would argue that Zira and Cornelius from Escape are from a similar timeline, but not the same. Here's my theory. The original movie, Escape, Conquest, and Battle all take place in the same timeline. The lawgiver mentioned in the first movie is the same lawgiver as Battle, and ape society did exist for around 2,000 years from 1991 to 3978. Beneath and Escape are from a different timeline where the world explodes in 1955, sending Zero, Cornelius, and Milo back in time. The reason we don't see Milo in the first movie is because he's not in that timeline, and he's busy rebuilding Taylor's ship in Beneath. Lucius, Zera's nephew from the first movie, doesn't exist in the Beneath timeline, which is why he never showed up in that movie. When Zera and Cornelius tell Dr. Hessline the story of how apes took over their timeline, they introduce the idea of ape slavery to that timeline, but that's not the only thing they introduce. See, in Conquest, Armando says that the dog-killing virus came from the astronauts. Which astronauts? Well, How about the ones that came from a timeline where we know that virus existed, i.e., Zira and Cornelius? The reason that things happen so much faster in this timeline is partially because of Caesar and partially as a self-fulfilling prophecy. The humans of Escape and Conquest think they know what's going to happen because they heard it from Zira and Cornelius. So they do exactly that and cause ape slavery to happen 3 centuries earlier than it did in the time-traveling Apes timeline. The ape revolution happens because Caesar exists in this timeline instead of an ape named Aldo, unrelated to the Aldo of battle. Now, this theory is by no means perfect, and there's definitely some other ideas we could have, like history being warped over time so that Aldo of battle becomes the hero of the story and Caesar is forgotten, or the time-traveling apes using Brent's ship instead of Taylor's, which would have just been easier to find and fix anyways, considering Taylor's ship sank and the time on one of them is just wrong. And so we get back to something I've mentioned a few times over this series. Are these inconsistencies clever writing that people don't understand, or just the writers being wrong? Now, as much as I like to think that the writers of these movies did some clever writing in there, more than likely, this is not one of those cases. And that's okay. Theories don't have to be about being right, they just have to be about making your brain think about things. And as long as you don't actually consider it canon, which I don't, it can be a lot of fun.
So, infinite regression then is...
It is the moment when our artist has regressed to the point of infinity, and himself becomes part of the landscape he painted, and is both the observer and the observed.